Today I'm going to talk a little bit about this system I have here. This is one of my cases. I'll talk a little bit about these modules I have in my case, and then I'm going to do a little performance that I wrote before the stream, so just a couple hours ago. And I usually perform with an Octatrack, which gives me a lot of options in terms of transitioning from part to part, and specifically transitioning being the most powerful tool that the Octatrack brings. And I don't have my Octatrack with me today. I have just what's in this case because I was making a demonstration video on the Arcus Audio Triple VC X Fader, and which is really cool, by the way. I don't have it here in this case now because I took it out and I brought it back down to the showroom. But the Arcus Audio Triple X Fader is a really cool module, and I think it would be worth your time to check out the video I made on it. And I will show you that video shortly, or just a little clip of it, and show you where you can find it. But it is a great demonstration, I think, or a decent demonstration on the Triple X Fader. Arcus Audio has been doing a really great job of coming out with some innovative utility modules, modulation modules, and one of them, my favorite one, I know it would be hard for you to see, this thing, the minute I saw it, this is a buffered mult with attenuators built into it, and what I do, and I'm doing it here at the top row here, I'm emulating this same setup as this buffered mult, is I'll take a static voltage from something like the WMD 410 here, which has got 4 attenuators, and it has these cool faders attached to it. But they all send out a static 5 volts out of these faders that, well, not static at 5 volts. As you adjust the fader, your voltage goes up, and at a maximum of 5 volts. And so I'll take that voltage and I will just send it out into a mult. It doesn't have to be a buffered mult. And then I'll pass that voltage along to different modules, but I'll run it into attenuators such as the Quadrat there, and send so that I can adjust its maximum value, because sometimes you don't want to send a ton of voltage to one source. Sometimes it might make it sound terrible. Like in the case of sending a ton of voltage to the low-quelic iteratus. If you're familiar with the low-quelic iteratus, it is a complex oscillator, and it can make some of the most abrasive and crazy sounds you can imagine. It sounds a lot like doing some real heavy modulation on an FM synthesizer, but it also can go into a much different territory than FM can go. Because it has the two, well, I don't know. Maybe that's not entirely true, because I think FM can get absolutely bananas. But the low quelic is a lot of fun to play with. And if you're looking for a complex oscillator in a small package, I highly recommend the low quelic. The only thing about it to note is that it is a digital module. If you're a strictly analog kind of person, then maybe that won't float your boat so much. But for me, if it sounds good, it goes in the case. If it fits, it sits. This is kind of my motto here. But yeah, back to what I was doing. So I often do this idea of creating some sort of macro because I want to be able to make large adjustments to my entire system. And if you don't have a bunch of like master effects in your modular system, you're kind of limited to what you can do with like a housey or a techno performance, right? Unless you're doing ambient or some sort of like noise or some experimental sounds, not having those conventions of high pass, low pass filter, some sort of like stutter effect or a freeze effect that allows you to loop at like quarter notes, half notes, things like that, you can get a little stale in your system. So modules like the Overseer by WMD are really useful because it's a high pass or low pass filter. Modules like the Modbang Performer is a really useful module to have at the end of chain. Having something like a Muscle from WMD, another good module to have at the end of your chain. There's several, and usually for me, I want them to be stereo. So I use a lot of stereo modules. If a module has a stereo output, I tend to be a little bit more interested in it. So let me just talk a little bit about what I got in the case here. As you may know, Matthew from Patchwerks. I work here at Patchwerks. And not everything in this case is available at Patchwerks, but for the most part, about 90% of these modules you're going to find in the case. For this particular setup right now, I'll just go from left to right and tell you a bit about each one of these modules, what they do, and why I chose them. This is a little bit different from what I've been doing every week for this week at Patchwerks. Like I said, every Friday at 3 o'clock, I'm here talking about music gear in general. A lot of it modular, but a lot of it with groove boxes and talking about deals and demos and such. But anyway, back to the case here. So starting from left to right, I might as well just start at the 1U row because I know a lot of people are interested in 1U modules, and there's so many coming out, and I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit later with some really great 1U modules that are available, and you can find them here at Patchwerks. So I'll start off with I'm not using it in this patch. So here's just mentioning that makes me want to talk about this, is that you don't have to use all your modules in every patch, okay? I hope that everyone feels the same way I do about that. You don't have to use them all every time. You don't have to use every cable that you bought and patch up so that there's just this massive plate of spaghetti here. And you don't have to input every input. You don't have to plug into all your inputs on your modules. I recommend experimenting with that, of course. Like, see what you can do, but also, dial things into taste. You're not wasting your modular by not patching 1,000 patch points. I don't know. That was on my heart, and I wanted to share it with you. Okay, so back here, we have the noise tools at the very top of the 7U module. This is a fantastic 7U, or a fantastic 1U module by Intellijel. This is where you're going to get just straight up noise, which is really good. It also has sample and hold and slew. Sample or track and hold you can toggle between, and it has slew. So if you're wanting to get that portamento and you don't have that in a module or in your case, or your sequencer doesn't come with an option to create portamento or a CV slide of some sort, you're going to want to get yourself something like a noise tools. So this is a good utility, just all around good thing to have. You'll find this in any of your standard keyboard synthesizers. So it's just good to keep it in around. And then next I have a buffered mult. What a difference between a regular mult and a buffered mult is that a buffered mult actually is using voltage to keep the voltages that you run into it at the level that you sent them to it, right? So with a passive mult, there's nothing there to keep the voltage at its static voltage that it came in at. So it will, very, very mildly, but the voltage will degrade as it passes through. So a passive mult, you may not want to use for stuff that you expect to have pitch tracking. You may not want to use it. You don't want to use it for audio, that's for sure, because it will dramatically decrease the value of your audio or the volume of your audio. Buffered mult you can pass audio into, so they're really useful to have, but you have to use your power supply. So that's the thing. If you are out of power supply, like if you don't have enough headers on your bus board left, a passive mult is going to do you just fine. You just don't run audio into it. And then to the next to that, we have the Quadrat, which is an Intellijel 1U module, unipolar, bipolar, attenuverter, attenuator, mixer. It's a really fantastic utility module. And I believe that these fantastic 1U utility modules are why people are so attracted to these Intellijel 7U cases and why they're so darn hard to find right now. And they do really seem like they are difficult to find. That Polycinematic is... Oh, here, let me just realize there's some chat in here, and I will say hello. Brian, that Polycinematic is epic. It is, and I'm going to play it for you. There's a little teaser. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yes, I'll talk about it a little bit more. I'm going to focus on more of the modules that I'm able to get into your hands at some point. This isn't one of them currently, hopefully in the future. Evan Bingham, did you get that black panel Geiger counters in yet? That is a good question. I don't know if we have the black panel Geiger counter in yet. I I do believe we have the Geiger counter in, but not sure about the black panel quite yet. Sorry that I don't have more of an answer. Need more navigators from Nicholas. Hey, Nicholas. Do I need more navigators? I'm sure Ryan from Acid Rain would agree with you wholeheartedly. Okay, I'm going to continue on here with the dissection of this skiff, just to talk about modular because it's fun to talk about. This next one here is the Xeroscope, which is an oscilloscope, tuner. Really, I said that like I was about to say there's a bunch more features it can do, but really that's what it is. It's an oscilloscope and it's a tuner. And both those things are fantastic, especially if you want to know what's happening in your system. Having an oscilloscope is really useful. You're like, oh, why isn't this working? Or why is this modulation source not affecting that? You run it into your oscilloscope and you see, oh, wow, you're not outputting any CV. Okay, well, maybe you need to check the ribbon cable on your module and see if it's plugged in. And sure enough, stuff like that. That's where it's really useful. Or just, you want to see what waveform you're creating when you're mixing two waveforms together. It has a X and Y version of the oscilloscope that's really cool, and you can build 3D shapes on it if you're clever. I haven't had a ton of success at creating 3D shapes, but I have created some pretty cool stuff on it, and it's just fun to look at as well. It's a flashy thing, and I know that a lot of us are into this because we like looking at our kit, we like looking at what we're doing, and we like these flashing lights where, we got that Tron mentality. I definitely do. So to the right of the Xeroscope, which I used to tune my oscillators today, is just a passive mult, which I was talking about with the buffered mult earlier. And then I have a line input, which I think is essential if you want to process anything. I'm a guitar player, so plug in my guitar or plugging in a 1/4 inch jack from one of my microphones in and, singing into my modular, processing it into modules like Clouds or even the Triptych and running that through distortion and a comb filter. It's a whole lot of fun, especially with the guitar. Or running it into the Desmodus Versio, for instance, which is like currently my favorite reverb module. Since I bought it, I have not thought about picking up a different one to replace it. Which I think we all kind of do that, right? There's always something new coming out and you're like, oh, is this better than the one I have? So far, this one has held me through since it came out. Honestly, I think it's been about a year or two. Anyway, fantastic. Check this out. If you just hold down this FSU. Oh, here we go. I love that. So it doesn't have any audio running into it. So that was just a ground floor being brought up and just saturated in the reverb, going full mix and full regen. And if you run a sound source into it, if I have something here, I'll send this to... Oh, that's coming here now. So it right there, it was acting as a reverb freeze, kind of. Not quite exactly that, because it isn't a reverb freeze, but it is pretty similar, and it sounds fantastic. It's awesome for doing build-ups with. If you don't have a noise source to just actually, that's a really good idea. I don't know why I hadn't thought of that yet. We'll pop this sucker in and just run it right into the... So now we can do it. Now I can do a build-up. Yes. All right. Now I'm a little bit more ready for showing you some music. Okay, so now I'm going to go over here to the Polycinematic, and I'll talk a bit about this. Polycinematic is an 8-voice synthesizer. This is a full-on polysynth with not a paraphonic synth. This is full poly, so that means that each voice runs through its own filter. It's a digital synthesizer. It has a great sound. It's pretty cool. Couple filter types, couple oscillator types. Pretty basic polysynth, but to have a polysynth in your modular is a nice addition, and that was the idea for me. I like creating like dancey house kind of tunes, and this is something that instead of having a sampler in here, which I'm probably going to end up putting back into this case because just sampled drums sound so good. It's like, I love synthesized percussion, but when it comes down to it, I really do like a certain kind of drum sound, and it's hard to find that exact sound and similarities to it without using a sampler. So it's a cool module. I have it connected to my Nerd sequencer, which is one of my main sequencers. I'm into trackers. I like trackers in general. The PolyN tracker is something that I vibe with pretty strongly and have enjoyed that quite a bit. See, the thing is about stuff like trackers is that once you learn one tracker, you really know them all for the most part. Some have some different workflows, but for the most part, you know what most of the commands are, and you know what those commands are going to do. You're just looking for some different verbiage and maybe some slight workflow stuff. And this sequencer, and I hope that we are able to get these into Patchwerks at some point, is a fun sequencer. It's not for everybody. It is for tracker people and people who are willing to learn the tracker workflow. And the tracker workflow is not... it's a tough thing to learn a little bit. It's kind of like learning a DAW by itself. It's pretty deep. I don't even know all the stuff it can do. It's too deep, honestly. It's just crazy. But it's a cool module. And so, like, why I chose this, and another sequencer that I really like to use is the WMD Metron and Volterra. Another sequencer that can do some similar stuff is the Erica Synths Black sequencer, which the WMD Metron and Volterra and the Erica Synths Black sequencer and the Metropolis, the new Intellijel sequencer, all of those sequencers can do some similar functionality to the one that I'm using in this case, and we carry them here at Patchwerks if you're interested in some of the things I'm about to talk about. And one of those things is stepped voltage. Now, stepped voltage is something I find extremely useful in Eurorack, and I use it in every composition. Anytime I'm writing in a modular scenario, I'm trying to turn my modular case into something that's a little bit more similar to a Groovebox, because that's just the way that I operate. So I know some people really operate in a place where they don't need sequencers at all. It's more of a random voltage and quantizers. And that is a place that I have played in as well, but it hasn't really been my personal thing so much, because I really want to feel a groove, and there's something about sequencers that can provide that for me, and I'm pretty sure it's because they're sequencing the groove for me. But what's cool about this sequencer and those other three I mentioned, the WMD Metron, Black sequencer, Metropolis, is the stepped voltage, and that means that I can save a voltage to a specific moment in the sequence and send that, and I can change the amount of that voltage per that moment in a sequence. Similar to just, locking in a note in your sequence, but doing it with something like just kind of an, not arbitrary, but just not a quantized voltage. So it's just, I'm able to set an amount of voltage with a note sequence, and I can send that out to a different synthesizer. So it's kind of like working on an Electron box. If you're familiar with Electron, as you're moving through the step sequencer, there's a couple of steps. You might hold down your steps, turn your knob, and change like the cutoff on your filter for just those steps, because it's just changing the feel of your music and making it a little bit more alive. So sequencers that allow me to do that so that I can emphasize key moments in my sequence are really important. Okay, so moving forward from that, I have the miniature synthesizer voice, which I actually originally was using that as my baseline when I first was working on this little composition that I haven't played for you yet. And that I switched over to my Loquelic and my A120, and I'll talk about them in a moment, just to change things up, because I often use this as my bass synthesizer. It really does that well. Let me tell you a little bit about the A111-6. It is a full mono synth in one tiny package, as you can see. It's a fully analog synthesizer. It offers a triangle and a sawtooth wave as its main waveforms, as well as a sub-oscillator that is a square wave, as most sub-oscillators are. And then it has I think it has a 24 dB low-pass filter. I'm having a hard time remembering if it is the 24 dB, but I'm pretty sure it's a similar filter to this A120 that I'm using. And so it's the kind of filter that when you give it a little bit of resonance, it starts removing a lot of your volume. So you don't use the resonance too much on these. You kind of just like accentuate this almost sound that I would consider kind of perfect for bass lines. So it's really great for doing bass lines. It has a built-in envelope generator, the whole deal, and it has all the CV that you would need to make that synthesizer start doing some cool movements. To the right of that, we have Surface by Qubit, and this module is a really fantastic sounding poly module. And the way that it does polyphony is, instead of like, obviously it's not like the Polycinematic, it doesn't receive MIDI. This is actually sending MIDI to the Polycinematic, even though you can just trigger things with your finger, or you can just trigger the chords. It allows you to save chords. That's neither here nor there. The Surface, the way that it does its polyphony, because it has 8 voices of polyphony at maximum, is that as its internal envelope that it has for its synthesizer, it's a physical modeling module, and its envelope will decay, and you turn up the decay, and as that note is decaying and the next note gets triggered, it will overlap. So that's where its polyphony comes in. You can't strike the notes at the same time. If you had something that arpeggiated very quickly across it, like really fast, something like a tracker would do, then you could kind of emulate the striking of a keyboard with the Surface. And it has an electric piano in there, so that would sound really good. It also has a choke. It has a bunch of different ways that it will use its audio. It's a stereo module, so it can do things in stereo. I mean, it doesn't have some when it's in its standard mode and sending out the same volume of the left signal and the right signal out of the Surface, it's going to come out and you can send it into a stereo module, but there's not going to be anything stereo happening. What happens to get actual stereo, the effect of it being stereo and having that be like part of the synthesis, is that you have these different options inside of it where you can choose that different models inside here. It has about eight models, I think. Inside the Surface will go out of different outputs, or you can have different notes come out at different outputs per node. So as it strikes the C, it'll come out of left, and it strikes an E, come out the right, so on and so forth, and it will just volley back and forth that way. So that's a cool module for that, and I love that it opens up the stereo field like that. Great sounding module. Right now I have it on its first model, which is like a string synthesizer. Then to the right of that, I have a Ucloud. This is a very, very, very old version of the first of the clones of clouds, and this was actually made by Instro at the time. You may not be able to see that, but there's a little Instro symbol there. And I've had it for a long time. It's the only clouds that I've had. Awesome. I mean, it's clouds, right? I think we all know clouds. If you've been watching this long enough, you know clouds is a granular synthesizer that has a bunch of different cool stuff that it can do as well with the Parasites firmware. And so it can be a delay, it can be a freeze delay, it can be just a reverb, or it can be just a granular synth, or it can be a synthesizer in general. So a very powerful module. But now we have Beads by Immutable Instruments, and that's been the successor and the replacer. And I do believe, in my opinion, that Beads is quite the successor and an improvement to clouds. However, Beads is much larger than my Uclouds, so it doesn't fit in this case, along with all the other modules that I wanted to. Okay, to the right of Uclouds, we have Platts by Immutable Instruments. Again, this is a classic module, and in the patch that I have set up currently, this is playing, let's see if I just nail it right here. Nope, that's the 909 hats. If you're able to hear that at all, that's Platts playing 2 different models. So Platts is what they call a macro oscillator. And the macro oscillator in Platts is 16 different algorithms of synthesis that it can do. And on one side of your synthesizer, one of the 8 of the 16, or this side here, the red side, if you're able to see that here, this red side is more in the physical modeling realm of synthesis, and it does more percussion and strings and more stuff that you would find in the Surface, honestly. It does some really great sounds. And Platts also has two different outputs, similar to the Surface. One's an auxiliary output, so like if you're in a chord mode, which it has, and I think everybody who has Platts loves the chord mode that it has. If you're in the chord mode, your auxiliary output will just output the root note of the chord. So it has all these cool features like that. You can take your auxiliary output as an alternate sound from some other sounds, or you can have it be in addition to a current sound because it will have a relationship with the sound that's playing. I'm using it as a hi-hat and like a little snare, like a little tiny snare, because the clap in the patch that I'm going to play is the most prominent sound. To the right of Platts here, we have the low Quellac Iteratus, which I first talked about. It's a really crazy module. It's complex oscillator, great sounding complex oscillator by Noise Engineering. I love Noise Engineering. They're one of my favorite companies. They their modules feel fantastic. They're really well built, and they perform the way you. They're very performative. So they make a lot of aggressive changes very easily. So the next one here is the A120 Vcf by Doepfer. This is a 24 dB low pass filter, diode low pass filter. This is the same filter you'll find in a Moog system. So if you're really into that Moogy kind of bass sound, you may think that's the oscillators, but it is the filter that makes it sound so warm and creamy. And that's what this filter can do. To the right of that, we have the Triptych, which is a really fun distortion module that also does comb filter synthesis. I'm not using it in this patch because the sounds that I'm playing are very chill, and it doesn't chill. That's not what you use it for. But I love having a good distortion module in my case, and I have no intention of taking it out at any point. This is a lifer, I think. It's a really good module, and the distortions sound really good. It has all these different options about how you want to route your distortion in and out of the comb filter. It has a filter in it as well, besides the comb filter. You can play the comb filter with a volt per octave. I mean, it does so much. It's a very multifunction module. To the right of that, we have FXAid, which is a fun module by Happy Nerding. It's an FX module, as the name suggests. It has 32 algorithms currently in this one, 32 algorithms of different effects that it can do. Right now it's being a stereo delay. To the right, Desmodus Versio, as I was talking about earlier, my favorite reverb. And then to the right of that, we have the Mix-Up, which is just a stereo mixer. And then over here we have the Nerd Sequencer I was talking about. It is a tracker. It's a cool module. And then my main modulation source, besides my sequencer, because I use sequencers for modulation sources a lot, is the Maestro by Acid Rain. This is my favorite LFO module. And then I'd say next in line from favorite LFO module would be PAMS, even though PAMS is more of a just clocking and gate triggering module, but it has lots of LFO functionality. It can be 8 different LFOs. So that's what I use PAMS for, because you can change each channel that way. Maestro can also be an envelope generator, which is really cool, and I like to use it as that. I'm not doing that in this patch, but I'm using it as a just as an LFO that's synced to my sequencer. Then to the right of that, we have my buffered mult with attenuators, like I was talking about with these two. Really good combos using buffered mults with attenuators. Most of everything here you can find at Patchwerks, so if you're interested in what I'm talking about, go ahead and go to patchwerks.com and check out the website. Then the 410, which I was also talking about before, I know I'm going backwards a little bit, just as I complete the whole system here, is a attenuator module with a static voltage and the faders. A static voltage and faders that you can control the static voltage with the fader. Super useful module. Have to have it. This is a must be in my case kind of module. So there's some stuff that is just completely essential. I can't take it out of the case because other things won't function the way I need them to without it. And this is one of those modules. Just a regular old utility module. Nothing super fancy about it. And then lastly, we have the WMT Performance Mixer, which, in my opinion, still reigns supreme as the best modular mixer you're going to find. Send returns. It's actually 8 VCAs as well, and 2 stereo VCAs, along with a bunch of other additional modules you can get to pair with it that work with it under the hood. Fantastic mixer. Sounds really good. It's got a pretty clean noise floor, like it's not too noisy for me. I'm able to use it and record with it, which is fantastic. Q output, headphone output, master send return, 2 auxiliary sends, 2 stereo channels. Then you have 2 different inputs per mono channel, or you can have them play at the same time. So there's a lot you can do. Like just having this one mixer allows me to have several voices in my system. Okay, that covers it. Lastly, of course, is these are Modbang glow-in-the-dark patch cables, which if you know me, then you know Modbang. Modbang is life. This is my Modbang hat, and great patch cables. I love them, of course, and a 7U Intellijel case. So now I'm going to just play a little bit of music, and then I'm going to do what I normally do, is talk a little bit about Patchwerks stuff, and then I'll let you go, and that'll be it. It's kind of funny how long you can be patching for to have it equal such a short amount of music, right? Without having, I was talking about earlier as I was patching this up, I usually have my Octatrack that I patch. Oh, thank you. I used to be an astronaut. Oh, if that is true and you used to be an astronaut, I have so many questions for you. Yeah, so there's a lot of things I would have done had I had more modules, more like master effects, like a high pass and a low pass filter, and been able to transition between effects. Oh, thank you, Tom. Nice micro set. It was a micro set. It was a little micro performance. I spent a lot of time talking and very little time performing, which is our preferred method in Eurorack. Yeah, so you got to kind of, I'm going to play some of these patches without other music with them, just give you an idea of what we're listening to. So this is the surface running into clouds, running into my mixer as a send to Desmodus Versio. So there's a little bit of Desmodus in that as well. It's just a great sounding module. It really fills the space. So the next one is this bass line here. And that's the low quality going into that diode low pass filter. So I got that kind of Moog feel, but with a much more complex oscillator sound than you'd find in a Moog system, because I'm using a complex oscillator. I also have an LFO coming from the Maestro that is running into one of the other CV inputs because it has so many on the diode. So I'm able to send it tons of different modulation sources. I have a ramp LFO that's going up for quarter notes, or half notes, I'm sorry. So it's just bringing the filter cutoff up every half note of the progression here, which is a great sound. And I love having modulation sources that are clocked like that, because it's something you would do in Ableton or Bitwig or Logic. It's you were automating the cutoff of your filter based on a lot of stuff based on your composition. So the next one over here is a nothing. So then we have the little drum sounds. Like I said, this is Platts going through two different algorithms. So I'm using stepped voltage, which is what I talked about before. I'm using stepped voltage to change the algorithm for me on steps that I want it to. So the voltage is going higher on one step. It's sending node information, but also voltage to its model input here on Platts saying move to the next algorithm just for that one hit. You can hear that. It's mostly hi-hats, and it kind of rolls into that smack of a snare sound. And this is a MIDI track on my sequencer playing the Polycinematic. Actually has stereo reverb in the module too, which I have cranked up pretty high. Here's one with a couple more chords in it. It's cool sounding, right? Nice to have that in your case. And then lastly, I just have some samples of snares and claps. So that's basically the patch. I'm using that trick I'm talking about of using your static voltage from something with a fader or a knob that sends out static voltage going into a mult, and it's changing the patch. So this is out me setting voltage. Setting voltage. Probably hard to hear me over that modular. Okay. All right, now we're going to go over to the last part of this week at Patchwerks. Thanks for hanging out with me so far. I know there's been some folks that have been sticking around since my mouse reactivates itself. Has a mind of its own. Okay.